So this is a general opportunity zone fund structure that I work with and see and kind of recommend to most people. So here we've got the Qualified Opportunity Zone Fund that is organized as a partnership. We have different partners coming in with their capital gains, investing into here. Then this QOF essentially drops down all their cash into this QOZB. And then the QOZB is truly the kind of heart of this fund and is doing all the business activity. So in this circumstance, it was a real property investment, and they'll be building, say, an apartment complex here, and that's their Qualified Opportunity Zone business. The key kind of things here is this Qualified Opportunity Zone business can't be a disregarded entity. It's got to be a partnership or some other regarded entity. And the main reason for that is kind of how we were discussing earlier. We really want this to be its own entity so we can meet the test that we kind of just went through. If we take this out and the QF owns this property directly, they're going to be subject to the 90% asset test versus in a QOZB, it's a 70% asset test. Additionally, a QOF does not have a working capital safe harbor. That means, say, if a Qualified Opportunity Zone fund gets $2 million of cash, they'll get a grace period for the first 6 months of that fund. And then after that, if they still have the cash in that QOF and they haven't expended it, that's a really bad fact pattern. So that's going to be covered in your denominator essentially when you're doing the 90% test, and only Qualified Opportunity Zone business property is going to be in your numerator. So if you've only spent about $1 million on a building and you have, $2 million of cash, you're likely not going to meet the 90% standard then. So that's kind of the biggest reason I recommend this structure, is just the cash flow purposes. Not having that working capital safe harbor makes it very onerous to ensure that you're meeting all the testing requirements all the time. I definitely have a few people who wanted the simpler structure and kind of did it this way, but in general, it's easier. One of the hardships that come here is, really finding how to make all these entities a partner. Certainly the QOF is probably easy to make it a regarded entity, but sometimes making that QOZB a regarded entity is a little harder, particularly when we're talking about a true operating business versus maybe a real estate fund where there's a developer. Okay, now we're going to go through some various different regulation updates from the final regulations. So one of the updates was pretty much like how do you treat unimproved land. There were a lot of kind of jokes when opportunity zones first came out that, hey, I could put like $1 million into like 10 acres of land somewhere and just not do anything with it because it's land, it's Qualified Opportunity Zone investment, so on and so forth. I invested my cash. And they really wanted to make sure that people weren't kind of just land banking or just buying speculative land and not doing anything with it. So they kind of came out with different rules to make sure that you're improving the land by an insubstantial amount. Like anything tax related, there's certainly no bright line test or any way for us to hard say yes or no with this, but they kind of outline different things that would count as this. So for example, I think on the West Coast, I saw a lot of people who were doing more of a agricultural type deals, and they wanted to know, hey, would the different irrigation system that I'm setting up count? Would these different things that I'm doing count, even though I'm not really changing the land at all? So yeah, they released more regulations on kind of how to determine whether or not land has been improved by an insubstantial amount. Additionally, they kind of lessened the restrictions on vacant properties. I think the final regulations provide kind of a 1-year requirement if the property was vacant at the date of the publications of the OZ designations. So that kind of came in handy for a few people. And if it wasn't vacant at the time of the OZ designation, if it was vacant for a continuous period of 3 years, then it would also meet the idea of being vacant property. The reason why you want the vacant property designation is it counts as original use when it's bought. which essentially means that you don't have to substantially improve the property. And that can be a really big thing for a lot of people. Additionally, they came out with some rules for brownfield properties. So this is essentially going to be properties composing of a brownfield site, including the land and structure. They did outline some rules that you have to make sure you're meeting the basic safety standards and health requirements and environmental requirements. But essentially, they said that these would meet the original use requirement as well. So thus, no substantial improvement requirement. Additionally, they came out with some more streamlined rules for self-constructed property. So this would be when you're kind of doing ground-up construction for a building, and how to really start measuring the tests when you are doing the tangible property standard. Additionally, they did clarify there was some concern by people because the regulations for the definition of qualified opportunity zone business property, it has to be acquired for purchase. So some people were slightly afraid that if they did ground-up construction, since it wasn't acquired for purchase, that it wouldn't count. Probably a little too granular of the regulations, and thankfully the IRS confirmed that yes, self-constructed property would count, and is obviously in line with the intent of the regulations themselves. One bad piece that the IRS came out with is improvements to non-qualifying property. So these would be assets purchased before 12/31/2017. Any improvements to these non-qualifying assets would not count as qualified opportunity zone business property. This kind of comes into play. So say someone had a really, really old rundown building, contributed into a qualified opportunity zone business, and was like, hey, let's just make all these improvements on it. It's pretty dilapidated building. You know, we could spend quadruple the cost just to get this up to par. The IRS pretty much said, nope, it's too hard to figure out where the cost came from. A lot of people disagree with that. I personally disagree with it. But essentially, if the property is non-qualifying, you can't make improvements to it. They did confirm on the IRS's like FAQ page for opportunity zones that if you contributed land into a qualified opportunity zone business that was considered related party property perhaps, so it would be non-qualifying OZ property, improvements on that would be qualifying property. So that's really good. I think we were kind of in limbo and wondering how the IRS would treat that for quite some time. So getting into substantial improvement tests, the IRS has different perspective, I think, than a lot of people had when the regulations were coming out. And essentially they've taken asset by asset approach, which becomes very hard for qualified opportunity zone businesses that are true operating businesses. For example, if you bought a building, if you bought a business and it came with some equipment that were already in the zone, so you couldn't qualify them as new property. A downfall to that would really be how do you substantially improve like one piece of equipment? Like that might be pretty hard to double down the basis in one piece of equipment, but if you were to aggregate all of them, it might be pretty easy. Unfortunately, they went with that asset by asset rule. They did do a carve out, however, for say real property, because you know I think they were kind of like, hey, you know, when we're doing a hotel or something like that, it might be really hard to separate the personal property from the real property components. So they did kind of set up new rules and give examples of how would they work. So for example, in the regulations, they had a hotel, and they essentially went through the different things that they bought that would be more probably personal property, mattresses, linens, furnitures, and based on the final regulations, they were kind of able to include all of that into their substantial improvement requirement. Let's see. Another big piece of the final and proposed regulations was they clarified that debt finance distributions would work in a QOF. So this was a huge question, particularly with real estate deals, where they typically, once the deal has become stabilized, they refinance the debt, do a big distribution out to the partners. And the question was, hey, does this, if I were to do this, would I then have to pick up gain? Thankfully, the final regs kind of said, hey, as long as you wait 2 years, we're going to treat this like a disguised sale if it was under 2 years. But as long as you wait that 2 years and you have enough tax basis to be able to take that loss, you'll essentially be good, and you'll be able to take that without causing an inclusion event for you to recognize your gain. So this is more kind of the point where I suggest people to make sure they're talking with their CPA and ensuring that partners will have tax basis and that a fund wouldn't accidentally be incurring a taxable transaction to their partners. But generally very good news on how to treat these as well. Triple net leases. So triple net leases in the course of the IRS have always been kind of a sticking point. And whether or not a true triple net lease is an active trader business is generally the question. The final regulations kind of stated, hey, merely entering into a triple net lease is not promoting an active conduct in a trader business. And they kind of went through some examples, defined kind of what a triple net lease would mean in these objectives. So they were certainly helpful in the information that they provided in the final regulations. It's still kind of a facts and circumstances type thing on what would be defined as a triple net lease for real property. But it becomes very important that if you're doing a real property development, that you can be designated as a true trader business. The IRS also clarified some leased property rules. So on top of being able just to buy assets, you can include leased properties as qualified opportunity zone business property as well. And they went through, hey, this is how you measure this and everything else in the final regs. So qualified opportunity zone businesses. The big thing here is the working capital safe harbor that we kind of discussed earlier. Essentially a big requirement that I feel like a lot of people miss is it is important to actually designate and write the working capital safe harbor and have the schedule written up in case the IRS were ever to request it. I feel a lot of people try to skip the working capital safe harbor write-up part. And granted, the IRS did not provide any examples of what this would look like or anything like that. So it's pretty vague, but you definitely need something in your file if you're doing a qualified opportunity zone business. They also went through, so a qualified opportunity zone business has 31 months to expend the cash. In the final regulations, they clarified that you can have a maximum 62-month working capital safe harbor if you were to have multiple cash infusions as well. The capital safe harbor can be delayed for governmental issues. So say your project's delayed and it's out of your control due to permitting or something like that. There is still a lot of uncertainty on, when to actually count qualified opportunity zone businesses as true assets. That's kind of a little in depth, so I won't really get into that as of today. A few key important pieces is a QOF can disregard recently contributed cash. So say they put in a bunch of cash into the fund, they can disregard cash from the previous 6 months when they're doing their 90% test. This was a huge issue because we're trying to figure out, hey, if a fund gets $2 million investments in December, how do they expend all their cash by their testing period? So the IRS kind of gave this guidance and leeway for those funds. Additionally, at any point, if a qualified opportunity zone fund invests in a qualified opportunity zone business and that qualified opportunity zone business doesn't meet the certification requirements to be a qualified opportunity zone business, they essentially allow for a 6-month grace, 6-month period for that entity to defect and to defect that failure in qualification. So essentially, each fund that invests in a QOZB is allowed one failure of the QOZB testing requirements for each QOZB. So the substantial improvement requirement, so that's when you bought a used building and needed to improve the building piece of this. So you have generally 30 months to improve that basis in the building. And during that time, essentially, it's kind of like the testing is paused during that 31-month period to not count against you for any of the testing requirements. Okay, kind of getting into one of the last pieces, which is, hey, what gains can I even invest in a fund? Pre-final regulations, 1231 gains, which are gains from the disposition of trade or business property, was really kind of messed up. I'll be honest. They wanted you to wait till December 31st of that year to be able to invest any gains. It created a lot of confusion, and I saw a lot of people investing their gain at the wrong time. Thankfully, the final regulations threw all those rules out, and now 1231 gains follow every other type of gain, which I think was huge for a lot of people, particularly the ones who had accidentally made their investment on the wrong day. So that is a really great thing that happened with the final regulations. Additionally, so I think we've spoke to, if you have a capital gain, you have 180 days to make that investment. Generally speaking, here's the non-generally speaking carve-outs. So if your gain is coming from a partnership or S corporation, your 180-day period starts from one of the following: either the date of the sale or exchange, if you know the partnership is not going to make the deferral, the last day of the entity's tax year, or the due date of the entity's tax return, 180 days from there. So you have 3 different options if it's coming from a partnership or S corp, and that's essentially, they added on that last one, due date from the entity's tax return, because so many people were getting K1s, not realizing they had these big gains and they could have made opportunities on investments. So they kind of added that last one on there to allow more time for that investment. Additionally, they clarified the treatment of installment sales. Previously, we were unsure if a pre-2018 installment sale could meet the qualifications of investing into an opportunity zone fund. They have clarified that it's based on the date the installment payment is received, and kind of gave a couple options on how to do that. So it's pretty great to be able to recognize some of these, like, a lot of clients I had maybe balloon payments or something coming in 2019 or 2020 that they were able to defer into a qualified opportunity zone fund instead of picking up that gain. The final regs also clarified a lot of the exit strategies. So initially how the code section was written was that if your QOF invested into a qualified opportunity zone business, the exclusion really only comes from you selling your investment in the QOF. So if the underlying assets were sold, we created this weird situation where the gain would happen at the lower tier and be pushed up, and then only the difference in the fund and the gain itself would be excluded. So that would be a very bad situation. So really the solution to that would be people would have to sell their LLC interests. And generally speaking, a lot of people don't want to buy someone else's LLC interest. They don't want the liability of taking on someone else's thing. So the IRS pretty much alleviated a lot of these concerns and pretty much said that assets that are coming from asset sales in a qualified opportunity zone business that's organized as a partnership or S corp, those gains themselves can qualify for the exclusion after 10 years. That is an important thing. If you sell a property interim the 10 years, so maybe you hold it for 3 or 4 years and sell the property, that will still be taxable. A few inclusion events. So these would be situations where you have to pick up your gain that you deferred. Essentially, these are going to come if you have either left the QOF, if you've had distributions in excess of your basis. Thankfully, they clarified that if you were to die, the beneficiary would not have an inclusion event. However, they kind of just completely step into the shoes of the person who had passed away. So they do have to pay tax and the deferred gain and everything else. So they're 100% stepping in the shoes of the last person. For divorce, transfers of investment between a spouse are considered an inclusion event. So very important to make sure those are right in your situation regardless. So in April, they released some opportunity zone corrections that were really for the final regulations. A few of those were really regarding some valuation pieces. So initially for each 6-month testing period, a QOF would have, they kind of wrote in the final regulations that intangible properties, so something that wasn't purchased, would have to be revalued every 6 months for each testing period. This created kind of an issue. So if your QOF invested into a partnership, essentially what that was saying is you'd have to revalue it every 6 months, which would be very onerous and kind of pointless at the same time. So they clarified that a partnership interest would just keep that initial unadjusted cost that you put into it. That's kind of the big piece from there. Also, very recently, they kind of came out with the Opportunity Zone Notice 2020-39, which was various different COVID extensions or relief for opportunity zones. Essentially what these rules dictate, so if you had a gain where your deferral period was going to end between December 31st and essentially December 30th, you have to tell December 31st, 2020 to make that investment. So that allows more investors more time to make their qualifying investments. Additionally, they said a QOF can fail their 90% test standard, essentially. So that's really huge because a lot of people were finding the deals that they were going to do, particularly around May-ish, June time, they weren't able to do anymore. So that was a very big piece for a lot of clients that I work with. Additionally, the substantial improvement period, which is the 30 months to improve the property, is paused from April 1st to the end of this year. So essentially, none of those months will count against you in that 30-month time period to substantially improve that property. Additionally, they extended the rules for working capital safe harbor and said that they may have an additional 24 months to expend that working capital safe harbor because of the emergency declaration throughout the country. So very big. There's a lot of planning decisions around this too for various clients. And additionally, that I feel like this is rarely kind of a situation that's happened already, but in general, so say if a fund had Opportunity Zone business property that it sold, you have 12 months to reinvest that property before the cash counts against you, so to speak. So they pretty much extended that time period that a fund would have to invest in it. However, based on the dates of it, I doubt many people were already selling their property at this point in time. But that's essentially high-level overview of opportunity zones. Kind of just to recap the big things, to be an investor in it, you have to have a qualified opportunity zone gain. And then typically the most important thing if you are setting up a qualified opportunity zone business, really ensuring that you meet with someone to make sure the structure is correct and that you're going to meet all the testing requirements. I think we saw in the beginning that there was a lot of confusion and a lot of people thought it would be a lot of onerous work. But really it's not. It's just kind of making sure you spend the time setting it up correctly, and once it's set up correctly, it's really not that hard. A lot of what I see are still a lot of real estate deals, but kind of as we talked about on these webinars before, is I think we know about the real estate deals because they generally have to go through the city and we're hearing about them, where people may start their businesses and there's no true reporting requirement for those. So those typically kind of just drop off and we're not able to track them as well. But otherwise, that's all for me. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll go back to you, Carl.
All right, yeah, I saw a couple of questions that trickled in, so we can touch on those now if you want. And someone asked, so what's the smallest deal you've seen done, or is there sort of a minimum baseline level of investment that you've seen?
Yeah, I guess it depends. So I think there's two kind of deals out there. There's what I call like the friends and family deals, which is, you kind of get people involved, and I feel like I've seen those as small as 100,000. And then there's the big investment ones that get a full, private placement memorandum and everything else, and they're going out and seeking investors. So it really depends. I've seen multi-million-dollar ones and very tiny ones too. It really just depends on who your investors are and what your project is.
Sure. In the chat box here, how much does it now cost to set up a single asset opportunity fund? So in terms of the structuring of that.
Gotcha. So, I mean, on the legal side of it, I probably couldn't speak to that. I mean, generally speaking, it's not too, especially if you just have a single asset and it's a real estate deal, it's not that hard to set up. It's kind of just making sure you have all the pieces in the right place. I would say what usually adds to the cost, which makes it way more expensive than a normal deal, is when you have related property in there. There's a lot more discussion with it and ensuring you meet those rules. Honestly, otherwise, I would say it's equivalent to, at this point, the same cost as, most of the other real estate deals that I work with.
Sure.
Absent maybe some, semi-annual testing and that sort of thing.
Sounds good. Then to answer another one, our slides and presentation being recorded or shared? Yes, they are. So if you want to be able to find this afterwards, it will be on our website and have that available. Another one just came in here. Is the investor's gain on the OZ property real estate determined by growth of the fund, or would it be by growth of the property?
So that's a good question. So if the fund or QOZB sells the real estate after 10 years, they get to step up that value. I guess I could leave to a potential variance there where the fund has other investments in it. But generally they're going to be pretty similar. So you're going to be able to step up the gain to the amount of the property sold essentially. And then there's probably like a small variance between what you still have left in your QOF. So that I'm guessing at that point they'd either just write that off or something else, because that's probably going to be a loss situation.
Okay. All right. Well, seeing no other questions, I think we'll continue with the presentation. But if you do have more questions, feel free to continue to send them in the chat, or save them for the end when we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. So I'll get back to my screen. And this next portion is going to look at, question is, so how can critical community leadership drive equitable development? So understanding, okay, we have this incentive here. Obviously, it has a lot of potential, but how can we as community members respond to this and also create conditions where we can see more investment? So, and really the tagline we've tried to emphasize from the beginning with this is, so making sure that you're not just waiting for investors to come to you. If you're a community involved in this process, it takes a lot of prep work on the front end to make sure that you're creating the conditions that are right for future investment. So there are a couple steps to that. First is really just building a team. So this can be educating your local developers, businesses, investors in the community, your city or elected officials, public sector partners, just making sure that everyone is on the same page and understanding there, and that there's at least a working knowledge in the community, so that when this sort of thing comes up, it's not something completely out of left field. So really, from there, it's an effort to try to tell a story, build a narrative around your community, why it's a good place to invest, why this opportunity, or if you have a specific project, why this is a valuable one to invest in, and sort of showing how it meets community needs, meets the community's goals, and otherwise it's just a good use of funds for an investor who may be looking at any number of possible zones across the country. So why here? How can you focus that down? Making sure that you're addressing those real needs in the community. So again, building that knowledge base means working together with between cities and townships, coordinating with the county level and at the regional level with organizations like SWIFT or your Regional Development Corporation, who are also potential resources, making sure your EDAs and staff are at least knowledgeable, getting Chamber of Commerce on board, neighborhood groups potentially. So a whole range of people who we think need to be at the table, and then bringing together some of these partners who can really fill in the expertise when other people may not know. So we have like accounting, wealth management, legal resources. So we have those in your community. That's an incredible asset. Otherwise, we have resources at a state level that we can connect you with to make sure that you have that expertise. Of course, educating local developers who maybe have a lot of experience in development but haven't used opportunities zones yet. So adding that to their toolbox so that they're aware of it. Building landowners who may be looking to make improvements. Again, people who may be savvy in certain areas but just have no experience with opportunity zones. So making sure that they're aware of the tool that's out there and making sure that they can use it. So you've got some community institutions, community groups that can really help herd things along. And then of course, local business owners too, especially as they think about either expanding their operations or moving to a new facility, ways that they could be tying into this as they build a fund either for their business or for the real estate asset. So what we've found of MNOppCo that is that a very valuable part of this is telling your story of why this community, why here, and sort of laying out that case. And that's why with the project listings that we've developed, we have that opportunity to tell the community story also. So you're sort of showing how this project really benefits the community, how it advances a community priority, and also may meet a need in the community that just gone unmet. So maybe it's not the most obvious investment opportunity, someone who's coming in from the outside, but if you can demonstrate local demand for whatever products they're coming out of that facility or new housing option, that's really how you can help drive that investment into the project. And because really the people you're targeting at are people in this group of investors called impact investors. So they're people who are seriously trying to find some sort of positive social return on their investment, but at the same time, they're still investors. So they're still looking to make that positive return for themselves. They're not going to be giving money away out of charity. So making sure that you have that understanding of where these people are coming from is really vital, because people are going to do a little extra work to understand their potential impact, but they're also still going to look for what can drive the return. And for the most part, people tend to go with what they're comfortable with and what they're familiar with. So it takes some effort to get in front of people and open their eyes to new opportunities. And we like to show this slide too, also just to sort of show where these impact investors sort of line up within the investing ecosystem. So certainly not traditional investors or even responsible investors where people may be, are trying to make the highest return but have certain assets that they don't want to invest in, or just don't want to invest in certain things that they perceive as doing harm. But at the same time, this is not a grant, it's not venture philanthropy, just trying to get something off the ground because someone believes in the cause and no more. And know that they really do need to still see that return. And this is that sweet spot where we've seen opportunity zones work. So some steps that communities can take when they're going through this process, sort of starting by just sort of taking an inventory of needs. Understanding what community priorities are, so that can be based on something like a comprehensive plan or a strategic plan for an EDA or something like that. But whether you've gone through that process recently or not, that's a valuable piece of background work, understanding, okay, is this actually meeting a need, or do we have needs we're not aware of, and how can we then combine that with a potential pitch for opportunity zones. Then and having those potential tenants for properties lined up ahead of time is also very beneficial too. I'd like to give an example of deals that actually work. So I'll do one that's also in a rural community, because I think for a number of reasons, a lot of the narrative around opportunity zones when they came out was that it's sort of investing in these large urban areas, historically disadvantaged neighborhoods, and certainly that's important. But at the same time, at the MNOppCo level, we realize that these investments are going to look very different across the state. And we need to make sure that we're tailoring these to the different communities that we see. So our example comes from Silver Bay here. So it's a city on the North Shore, opposite corner of the state for most of you in northeast Minnesota. It's a town of 1,600 people, and the opportunity zone is a little larger than that, but not much. And it's one little community on the North Shore where if you drive up the North Shore, you probably you pass through all these state parks. You have these towns that are full of tourists like Grand Marais and Two Harbors, but then you have Silver Bay, which is right in the middle there, and it's got a big mining plant, and you may not know what else is there. So it's a community that has kind of a one-dimensional economy that revolves around the mine, and historically there's been very little tourism, very little diversification there. But over the past 5-6 years or so, some of the community leaders up there have really done a good job of trying to lay the groundwork for something else. So fairly recently, they developed a marina on the lake shore. There's opened up a new beach. It's a black beach, has black sand on it, sort of right in the town there. And then right next to that, they just opened up a campground this year too. That's now up and running. So obviously trying to change the narrative there, be more aware of the major tourism market you have on the North Shore that they just weren't tapping into before. And so the opportunity zone project they have is called the Adventure Park on the North Shore, this giant ropes and rock climbing course that has gone up. It's a concept that the two owners had seen be successful in other parts of the country. They'd seen this work. They thought they had a business model and figured we can make this work in Silver Bay. They came in and I think very carefully started doing this in phases. So I started with just some ropes up a rock wall, but then really from there started going out, proving this worked and showing investors, hey, we have a project here that'll work. And so they got the investment to put in the ropes course, which opened up last year. And as far as we know, it's been a total success. And even through COVID, which has obviously been damaging for the tourism economy in the state, still been able to keep going and have steady activity this summer. Created 16 jobs in the area, with eventual goal of 25. And then it's really meeting a lot of those city priorities of economic diversification. They took what had been a vacant, empty gas station property on a corner heading into town and turned it into a thriving business. There's potential for expansion beyond this further down the main highway corridor there. Can also help drive some traffic into town, which, if you know, Silver Bay can be an issue because a lot of people just drive through on the highway through there and don't turn off and actually go and stop in the town where there are businesses. And so meeting a lot of goals and just sort of showing that these sorts of projects can work even in very rural communities where which haven't been the focus of opportunity zones nationally. And one other piece we like to talk about in these presentations is the idea of equitable development. It's another area where there was some concern about opportunity zones, especially at the start when saw this come out, was that, oh, this is just going to be a tool for these investors to funnel their funds into some sort of tax haven, and then there's going to be no real tangible benefit to the community because they've just put up some luxury apartments or something that has no benefit. And certainly I don't think we'll deny that there's the potential for that with opportunity zones, but at the same time, I think we understood from the beginning that if you help frame the narrative and build these community conversations around these potential projects, you can make sure that you really are pushing equitable development. So if the community is looking for a tool to help themselves with that, we have our partners at Nexus, community partners who are based in the Twin Cities, who have developed this equitable development scorecard. And we're trying to understand, does this project meet with our goals and needs? Is it having the social impact we really wanted to? They have this toolkit that's available. And I certainly recommend that if anyone thinks that will be a valuable addition to their discussions about how the opportunity zones work in their community, that they explore that potential tool and use it, because it's very adaptable, and you can certainly take this and edit it as you see fit to meet the needs of your community, but sort of making sure you have a framework for understanding how those projects get off the ground. An example that they provided of how they use this scorecard successfully was west side of St. Paul. So it's a neighborhood, west side of St. Paul means south of the river. I'm not sure how they got there with their geography, but that's where it is. So it's a neighborhood that's mostly an opportunity zone, and they use the scorecard with the community group to talk to the potential housing developer to make sure that they're meeting the community priorities. And because they got some opportunity zone investment into this project, they were able to really help it more meet the needs of the community. So in this case, a project that was going to be 60%, I think was going to include some affordable housing, was able to get from 60% of the area median income down to 50%, so that able to be even more affordable for the residents in the area. And they also got some contractors to honor the prevailing wage rates in the area, so again, providing jobs potentially for people who live in the area. So it's and something that they're continuing to monitor on an ongoing basis, so that they can make sure that investment is being used in a way that helps the community. So that's our example of how that can be used successfully. And the link to that scorecard is available here. LISC Duluth is another community organization that is operating in the same area. It's also developing its own social impact investment framework. That's not complete yet, but once it is, we'll make sure we have that available on our website also as a resource for people who are trying to understand how to push social impact investing. And they're really framing it as social impact beyond opportunity zones, realizing that this incentive may or may not continue for years and years, but it may take an act of Congress to extend it. So at the same time, there will always be social impact investors, always be people looking to drive that, to find homes for their money that support community investments or needs. So make sure that they have a framework for thinking about how that can work and how they can be collaborative there. So with that, I think I will open it back up to Q&A. Looks like we had a couple more come in through the chat box here. First one here is, so when does the opportunity zone investment incentive officially sunset? So Danielle, do you want to tackle that one?
Yep. Sorry, I had trouble getting out of the mean view. Yeah, of course. So opportunity zones, like the investment into one. So they're going to look to the last year, 2026. So I think you technically have until like mid-June 28th or whatever the exact date, 2027, to make that investment, but the gain has to occur in 2026 or before.
Yeah, so certainly plenty of time still, plenty of runway to still get these out and then really realize the biggest gain, which is on the back end. That's, I believe, all I have right now. Are there any further questions that people would like to ask? Feel free to unmute yourself if you just want to verbalize them. Otherwise, feel free to put them in the chat.
My name is James. I have one question. It's a follow-up on the question you previously answered. In terms of the investment incentive, like sunsetting, I understand it runs until 26, 27, but at some point, do we lose that 10% real value of the basis step up?
Yep, the cutoff date's 2047.
Okay.
That they currently have in the regs.
All right. I'm just drawing from some conversations with possible investors and projects, and that have pointed us to the end of 2021 as kind of a period where we need to perform by then in order for the value of opportunity zones to be, I guess, most compelling for investment. I'm trying to understand where that statement has come from. If you know.
Yeah, I'm guessing that's coming from the 5-year step up point. So an investor in 2022 wouldn't have 5 years between then and 2026 to get that 10% step up in basis. So that's what I'm guessing is they're alluding to. Okay.
Sometimes these details just don't come through in, general conversations, or there isn't an opportunity to unpack it. I got one more question since we're chatting, and then give the floor back to everybody. I was looking at the diagram, the structure that you had outlined earlier with opportunity zone fund and then zone business, and where a partnership fits into all of that. I'll do my best to explain. In terms of equitable development, where there's an interest in local ownership on the part of someone or some entity, owning property, I think, Danielle, you mentioned earlier that property ownership by I believe a OZ business or maybe the fund is a necessity. I'm just curious, how formal does this get? Does the Opportunity Zone Fund need to own more than 50% in the scheme of a partnership to accomplish a project together? Or is it more flexible than that? Does this make sense?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand.
Yeah, I'm just interested in how a fund partners with another entity in a local community project, where ultimately the fund will probably not own indefinitely forever and ever after the period of investment time. Mm-hmm. Does the fund need to own the entire project in a formal sense, like more than 50% or all of it officially?
Nope. So the fund only owns a portion of it. So say that local investment's a partnership. The whole partnership has to meet the qualifications of being a qualified opportunity zone business, but the fund isn't required to hold a certain amount. So I've seen that before too.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I have a question in the chat box here. So if an investor puts $500,000 into QOF to purchase property in QOZ, 10 years later, this investor sells the property for $3 million. So which gain is eliminated, the $500,000 or the whole $3 million? And I think the answer there would be the difference, right? So we'd have what, $2,500,000 would be the gain. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Essentially, so the partnership or whatever entity is going to have the sale of the property is going to push it through, and then that's essentially what's going to be excluded.
All right. Any more questions? Feel free to type or just unmute yourself. All right, well, hearing none, I mean, I know we threw a lot of information at you today, so again, we'll get the contact information for both Danielle and myself out. And if you have further questions, feel free to reach out to us and ask those. We'll just roll through a couple of final slides here. For you to look at the, some of the resources. We got the MNOppCo website, some of our partners who are involved in this area have resources that are available, also have here. And of course, the submission forms, you want to add a project to the MNOppCo database, we have all those links again right here. Then some resources, which again, this is not us endorsing any one of these, but these are people who we know of who are operating in the legal or accounting areas in this area. So including Danielle, so people who are experts in this area who we know have worked on deals, so and may be able to help if you have some of those legal or accounting questions that we can't answer. There's contact information for team on this here today, and that is all I have. So I guess one last opportunity for questions. Do you want to share anything? Otherwise, thanks for attending. All right, hearing none, I think we can wrap things up here. So thanks again to Scott and Swift for having us today, and feel free to follow up if you have any questions. Thanks, everyone.